April 6, 1945. 23 miles northwest of Okinawa, aboard the destroyer USS Leutze, Commander Bruce Leon stood on the bridge wing, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the hazy afternoon sky. The temperature hovered around 72 degrees, humidity making uniforms cling to skin despite the wind created by the ship's 18-knot patrol speed. Through the voice tube from the Combat Information Center came the report every destroyer captain had learned to dread over the past 5 days. Bridge, CIC. Multiple bogies inbound, bearing 350, range 12 miles, closing fast. Count is 4+, possibly 6. Leon's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander James Walsh, appeared at his shoulder. Captain, recommend we come about to unmask all batteries and prepare for evasive action. It was standard doctrine, the procedure drilled into every destroyer captain since 1942. When aircraft attacked, you turned to present your narrow beam to the threat, maximizing the number of anti-aircraft guns that could engage while minimizing your profile as a target. Leon lowered his binoculars and looked at Walsh. What he was about to order violated every tactical manual the Navy had published. Negative. All engines ahead flank. Come right to bearing 350, we're going to meet them head-on. Walsh's face went pale. Sir, that course takes us directly toward the attack formation. We'll be bow-on, only our forward batteries can engage. I know what course I've set, XO. Execute the order. Leon's voice was steady, but his hands gripped the bridge rail hard enough that his knuckles showed white beneath tanned skin. The question hanging unspoken between them was simple. Had Captain Leon just ordered his ship and 317 men to commit suicide, or had he discovered something that might save them all? To understand why Leon made this seemingly insane decision, you need to understand exactly what was trying to kill him and why conventional evasive tactics had stopped working. The kamikazes attacking American destroyers off Okinawa in April 1945 weren't the desperate, poorly trained pilots of popular imagination. They were the product of a systematic, mathematically optimized doctrine that had been refined through 6 months of operations, and they were devastatingly effective. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The formal name for the kamikaze units was Tokubetsu Kogekitai, or Special Attack Units. The first organized kamikaze attacks had occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, concluded that Japan's dwindling air forces could no longer achieve meaningful results through conventional attacks. The mathematics were brutal. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation had lost most of its experienced pilots. Those who remained faced American fighter pilots with an average of 350 to 400 hours of flight training, flying aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair that were superior in virtually every performance category. A conventional attack on an American task force required pilots to penetrate the combat air patrol, survive the wall of anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers, and then successfully deliver bombs or torpedoes against the capital ships at the center of the formation. The success rate for conventional attacks against well-defended American formations had fallen below 5%. Most Japanese aircraft were shot down before releasing their weapons. Those that did release weapons scored hits on only a tiny fraction of attacks. Onishi's innovation was to eliminate the need for the aircraft to survive. A pilot who deliberately crashed his aircraft into a target-guaranteed weapon delivery. The entire aircraft, loaded with explosives and fuel, became the warhead. More importantly, the physics of defending against kamikaze attacks fundamentally differed from defending against conventional attacks. A conventional bomber could be driven off by anti-aircraft fire, damage the aircraft badly enough, and the pilot would break off the attack to attempt survival. But a kamikaze pilot had already accepted death. Damage to his aircraft mattered only if it prevented him from reaching the target. You had to destroy the aircraft completely, causing it to explode in mid-air or killing the pilot instantly, because anything short of total destruction meant the kamikaze would continue closing until impact. The tactical doctrine developed by the Special Attack Units between October 1944 and April 1945 reflected sophisticated understanding of American defensive capabilities and systematic analysis of what worked. Japanese commanders had reviewed hundreds of attack reports, interviewed surviving escort pilots, and refined their approach through iterative improvement. By April 1945, kamikaze formations typically approached American task forces at altitudes between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, high enough to avoid the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft fire, but low enough to maintain visual contact with targets. The formations would identify the screening destroyers on the outer ring of the task force defensive perimeter, typically positioned 8 to 12 miles from the carriers and battleships they protected. The kamikazes would then divide into smaller elements, usually groups of 2 to 4 aircraft, and initiate their attacks from different bearings simultaneously. This saturation approach overwhelmed the defensive capabilities of individual destroyers, forcing them to divide their anti-aircraft fire among multiple threats. The attack profile itself followed a calculated pattern. Kamikazes would begin their final dive from approximately 8,000 feet altitude at a point roughly 4 to 6 miles from the target destroyer. The dive angle typically ranged from 30 to 45 degrees, steep enough to build significant speed, but shallow enough to maintain control and make targeting adjustments. The physics of this attack profile created a closing speed between 400 and 500 miles per hour by the time the aircraft reached the target. At that velocity, a destroyer's anti-aircraft guns had approximately 45 to 60 seconds to engage from the moment the kamikaze committed to its dive until impact. The mathematics of engagement were unforgiving. A destroyer's main anti-aircraft armament consisted of 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 40mm Bofors quad mounts, and 20mm Oerlikon cannons. The 5-inch guns, while powerful, had a rate of fire of only 15 to 20 rounds per minute and required time to calculate fire control solutions. Against a target diving at 400 miles per hour and making evasive maneuvers, hitting with 5-inch shells required exceptional gunnery and considerable luck. The 40mm Bofors had better volume of fire, approximately 160 rounds per minute per quad mount, but their effective range against aircraft was limited to roughly 4,000 yards. That gave gunners perhaps 20 to 30 seconds of engagement time. The 20mm Oerlikons, while numerous and capable of high rates of fire, had effective ranges under 2,000 yards. They represented the last-ditch defense, firing when the kamikaze was already so close that impact was seconds away. American destroyer captains in early 1945 followed standard evasive doctrine that had been developed for conventional air attacks. When multiple aircraft attacked, the standard procedure was to turn the ship to present its beam to the threat. This accomplished 3 objectives according to existing tactical theory. First, it unmasked the maximum number of anti-aircraft guns, allowing both port and starboard batteries to engage. Second, it presented the narrowest possible target profile to the attacking aircraft. A destroyer's beam width measured only 40 feet compared to a length of over 370 feet. Third, it allowed the ship to maneuver perpendicular to the attack axis, potentially causing the diving aircraft to miss a head or a stern as the ship moved laterally beneath the dive path. This doctrine made perfect sense against conventional bombing attacks, where the aircraft released its weapons and then pulled away. Against kamikazes, it was proving catastrophically ineffective. Between January 1st and April 5th, 1945, during preliminary operations against targets in the Philippines, Formosa, and the Ryukyu Islands, American destroyers on radar picket duty and screening missions had been hit by kamikazes at an alarming rate. USS Brain had been struck by 2 kamikazes on March 27th, suffering 66 killed and 78 wounded. USS Halligan had been sunk by a combination of mine and kamikaze damage on March 26th, with 153 casualties. USS O'Brien had been severely damaged on March 27th by a kamikaze strike that killed 50 men. The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Destroyers following standard evasive doctrine were being hit despite putting up tremendous volumes of anti-aircraft fire. The problem wasn't the courage or skill of the crews. American destroyers were engaging kamikazes with everything they had, filling the sky with thousands of rounds of 40mm and 20mm fire. But the kamikazes kept coming, and they kept hitting their targets. Some destroyer captains were beginning to suspect that the standard evasive doctrine might actually be making their ships more vulnerable, not less. The mathematics of the problem became clear through systematic analysis. When a destroyer turned beam on to a diving kamikaze, it created what engineers call a wide tracking solution. The attacking aircraft had to track laterally across the target's movement, adjusting its dive path continuously as the destroyer moved perpendicular to the attack axis. Human pilots, even experienced ones, struggled with this type of tracking, but they didn't need to be perfect. The destroyer's 370-foot length meant that even if the kamikaze's aim was off by 50 or 75 feet, the aircraft could still hit somewhere along the ship's length. Moreover, the beam-on position meant that if the kamikaze did hit, it would impact along the ship's side where the hull was relatively thin and where critical spaces like engineering plants, ammunition magazines, and crew berthing were concentrated. A single kamikaze striking amidships could break a destroyer's back. There was another problem that few had explicitly recognized, but that some of the more experienced destroyer captains were beginning to understand through bitter experience. When a destroyer presented its beam to a diving kamikaze, the relative motion between ship and aircraft created an optical effect that actually made it easier for the pilot to judge his impact point. The Japanese pilots had been trained to use the target ship's apparent movement across their windscreen as a reference for adjusting their dive. A ship moving beam on provided a clear, linear reference. The pilot could see whether he was going to hit a head or a stern and adjust accordingly. It was the same principle that duck hunters used, leading a moving target by tracking its lateral motion. The kamikaze pilots were essentially hunting destroyers the same way. Several destroyer captains had filed after-action reports noting this phenomenon, though they lacked the technical language to describe it precisely. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger of USS Enterprises Screen had written in a report after an engagement on March 19th that the attacking aircraft appeared to track our evasive maneuvers with disturbing accuracy, adjusting his dive path as though following our movement across his gun sight. Lieutenant Commander Robert Smith of USS Pritchett had observed after an attack on March 21st that the pilot seemed to anticipate our turn, rolling his aircraft to follow our beam as we presented broadside. These reports, buried in the daily avalanche of after-action paperwork flowing through fleet headquarters, contained the seeds of a tactical revolution. But revolution requires someone to recognize patterns, to question assumptions, and to be willing to try something that every instinct and every manual said was wrong. Commander Bruce Leon of USS Leutze was that someone, though he would have been the first to admit he didn't arrive at his insight through systematic analysis. He arrived at it through fear, observation, and a conversation in a junior officer's wardroom 3 days earlier, April 3, 1945. USS Leutze had been conducting radar picket duty 70 miles north of Okinawa, part of the ring of destroyers positioned to provide early warning of incoming Japanese air attacks. The duty was considered the most dangerous assignment in the fleet. The picket destroyers were isolated, far from the concentrated anti-aircraft protection of the main task force, and they were the first ships the kamikazes encountered. On April 3rd, Leutze and her sister ship USS Morris had been attacked by 6 kamikazes in a coordinated strike. Both ships had followed standard doctrine, turning beam on to unmask their batteries. Morris had been hit amidships by a Mitsubishi A6M0 carrying a 250-kilogram bomb. The impact and subsequent explosion had killed 16 men and wounded 47. The ship was combat ineffective and had to withdraw to Keramaretto for emergency repairs. Leutze had Escaped damage only because one of the attacking aircraft had been shot down by a lucky burst of 5-inch fire when the aircraft was still 3 miles out, and the other kamikaze targeting Leutze had mistakenly dove on a nearby destroyer escort instead. Leon understood with crystalline clarity that his ship had survived through fortune, not skill. That evening, shaken and unable to sleep, Leon had gone to the junior officer's wardroom for coffee. He found Lieutenant Junior Grade Paul Henderson, the ship's gunnery officer, hunched over a plotting table covered with diagrams and calculations. Henderson looked up as Leon entered, clearly startled to see the captain. "Sir, I was just trying to understand why we can't hit these bastards." Leon poured coffee from the battered pot on the wardroom sideboard and sat down across from Henderson. "Show me what you've got." What Henderson had was the beginning of a tactical analysis that would change everything. Using engagement data from Leutze's attack and from reports he'd obtained from other destroyers, Henderson had been plotting the geometry of kamikaze attacks. He'd calculated closure rates, engagement times, and firing solutions. The numbers painted a grim picture. "Captain, our gunnery solutions assume we're engaging an aircraft that's trying to survive. The fire control computers calculate lead angles based on the aircraft maintaining course and speed or maneuvering to evade. But the kamikazes don't evade. They maneuver only to adjust their aim. It's fundamentally different." Henderson traced a line on his diagram showing a typical kamikaze dive path. "When we turn beam on, we think we're presenting a smaller target. But look at the geometry from the pilot's perspective. He's diving at approximately 40 degrees. Our beam presents a target that's 370 feet long and, he consulted his notes, approximately 60 feet high, including superstructure. That's a target area of roughly 22,000 square feet. Leon studied the diagram. "What's the alternative? If we stay bow on or stern on, we present even more height." Henderson nodded. "Yes, sir. But the width drops to 40 feet. The target area becomes roughly 3,600 square feet. It's 6 times smaller. But we can only engage with forward or aft batteries. We lose half our firepower." "Yes, sir, but here's the thing." Henderson pulled out another sheet covered with timing calculations. "When we turn beam on, the kamikaze has to track our lateral movement. He has time to adjust. His dive path might be 45 seconds from commit to impact, and he can make corrections throughout. But if we're bow on and driving toward him, the geometry is completely different. He has almost no lateral tracking problem. We're nearly stationary in his windscreen, but any miscalculation in his dive angle or timing, and he misses completely. He can't adjust laterally because there's no lateral dimension. He either hits the bow or he overshoots." Leon sat back, coffee forgotten. The mathematics were elegant and terrifying. "You're suggesting we charge them? Drive straight at aircraft diving at 500 miles per hour?" "Yes, sir. I think it's the only way to reduce our target profile enough to matter. And there's something else." Henderson hesitated, then continued. "I've been talking to some of the lookouts. They say when we turn beam on, the kamikazes seem to adjust their dives to follow our turn, like they're tracking us. But in the few cases where ships have maintained course toward the attack, the kamikazes seem to struggle more with the aim. It's just anecdotal, sir, but it matches what I've been seeing." Leon stared at Henderson's diagrams. Everything in his training, everything in the tactical publications, said that turning beam on was correct procedure. But everything in his gut, reinforced by Henderson's mathematics, said otherwise. "Keep working on this, Mr. Henderson, and keep it quiet. If you're wrong, I don't want this spreading through the fleet. If you're right." Leon didn't finish the thought. If Henderson was right, then standard doctrine was getting people killed. The next morning, April 4th, Leon had done something that could have ended his career. He'd requested a private communication with Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, commander of the escort carrier task group that Leutze was screening. The communication had been brief and highly irregular. Leon had presented Henderson's analysis and requested permission to deviate from standard evasive doctrine during the next kamikaze attack. Durgin's response, as Leon later recounted it, had been characteristic of the Admiral's pragmatic approach to warfare. "Commander Leon, I cannot authorize you to violate published doctrine. However, I will note that tactical decisions in the heat of combat rest with the commanding officer on scene. If you believe alternative maneuvers will better preserve your ship and crew, you are expected to exercise your judgment. I will support whatever decision you make." Durgin out. It was as close to official permission as Leon was going to get, which brought him to April 6, 1945, with 6 kamikazes inbound and a decision to make that would either validate Henderson's mathematics or kill everyone aboard Leutze. "All engines ahead flank. Steady on course 350. Leon's order went out through the voice tubes. Below decks, in the forward engine room, sailors opened throttles fully. Leutze's propellers bit into the East China Sea, and the destroyer surged forward, accelerating from 18 knots to 33 knots, nearly 38 miles per hour. On the bridge, every officer and enlisted man understood what was happening. They were driving directly toward the incoming kamikazes, presenting their bow to the attack. Only the forward 5-inch mount and a few of the forward 40mm and 20mm positions would be able to engage. More than half their anti-aircraft firepower would be masked by the ship's superstructure, unable to bear on targets approaching from dead ahead. Lieutenant Commander Walsh moved close to Leon. "Sir, the men should know why we're doing this." Leon nodded. He picked up the shipwide announcing system handset. His voice, amplified throughout the ship, was calm and carried absolute conviction. "All hands, this is the captain. We have 6 enemy aircraft inbound. We are going to meet them head-on rather than turn beam-on as per standard doctrine. This will reduce our target profile by approximately 80%. The mathematics support this approach. I believe it gives us the best chance of survival. I have complete confidence in this crew and this ship. That is all." In the forward 5-inch gun mount, Gun Captain Chief Petty Officer Michael Riley heard the announcement and allowed himself a slight smile. The old man had balls. He'd give him that. "You heard the captain," Riley told his gun crew. "We're going to be the only game in town. Make every round count. Load VT fuse. Commence firing on radar lock." The VT, or variable time fuse, was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The fuse contained a miniature radar transmitter that detonated the shell when it detected itself approaching a target. VT-fused 5-inch shells didn't need direct hits. They exploded in proximity to aircraft, filling the air with shrapnel that could shred control surfaces and kill pilots. Through the fire control radar, Riley watched the contacts closing. Range: 8 miles, 7 miles, 6 miles. Mount 51 reports radar lock, continuous solution. Riley's phone talker relayed information from the fire control system. At 5 miles range, the forward 5-inch mount opened fire. The first shell left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second, arcing upward to meet the incoming aircraft. 4.5 seconds later, it exploded 300 feet ahead of the lead kamikaze. The explosion achieved no visible effect. The kamikaze formations continued closing. Mount 51 fired again, and again. The mount's crew achieved 15 rounds per minute, the mechanical loading system performing flawlessly despite the stress and heat. At 4 miles, the kamikazes began their final approach. 2 aircraft dove toward Leutze from slightly different bearings, converging on the destroyer's bow. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The attack profile Henderson had predicted was playing out with mathematical precision. The kamikazes, both Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bombers designated Judy by Allied intelligence, rolled into their dives at approximately 35 degrees. Their engines were screaming at full power, propelling them downward at accelerating velocity. From the kamikaze's perspective, the geometry was unlike anything the pilots had trained for. Usually, target ships turned beam on, presenting a long, linear target that moved laterally across the windscreen. The pilots had been trained to track that lateral movement, adjusting their dive paths the way a hunter leads a duck in flight. But Leutze wasn't presenting her beam. The destroyer was bow on, driving toward them at 33 knots. Through the diving pilot's windscreens, the target appeared almost stationary, a narrow grey shape that grew larger with each second but didn't move laterally. There was nothing to track. The pilots had to estimate range, judge the dive angle, and time their final adjustments based solely on the apparent growth of the target. It was a completely different visual task, and it was proving far more difficult than tracking a beam-on target. The lead kamikaze pilot, a 19-year-old flight reserve ensign named Takeshi Yamamoto, recognized the problem. He'd participated in 3 previous attacks and scored 1 hit on a destroyer. Those attacks had all been against beam-on targets where he could use the practice technique of tracking lateral movement. This was different. The American destroyer ahead of him wasn't giving him that reference. It was just growing larger, and he had no reliable way to judge whether his dive angle would bring him to the target or cause him to overshoot. Yamamoto adjusted his dive, steepening it slightly. Below him, the destroyer's forward gun mount continued firing. He saw muzzle flashes, saw the black puffs of anti-aircraft bursts forming a vertical curtain ahead of his aircraft. One burst was close enough that he felt the shock wave through his control stick. The American gunners were good, very good. Range 2,000 feet. Yamamoto could see details now. Men on the destroyer's bridge, the white water at the bow from the ship's flank speed. The American flag snapping from the mast, 1,000 feet. Yamamoto pushed his control stick forward, steepening his dive further. The ocean and the destroyer's bow rushed up to meet him. 500 feet. Yamamoto could see the faces of men in the forward gun mount, could see the gun barrel elevated toward him, saw the muzzle flash as the gun fired again. Time seemed to dilate. Every second stretched into minutes. Every detail burned into his consciousness with hallucinogenic clarity. Then he was overshooting. Yamamoto realized it with sick certainty in the last second of his life. His dive angle was too steep. He was going to pass over the destroyer's bow and impact the water beyond. He tried to pull up, to flatten his dive path, but there was no time and no altitude remaining. The Judy plunged into the East China Sea 40 feet ahead of Leutze's bow. The aircraft and its 250-kilogram bomb exploded on impact with the water. The underwater detonation created a massive shock wave that lifted Leutze's bow 3 feet, slammed every man aboard against steel bulkheads and decks, and shattered gauge glass throughout the forward spaces. But it wasn't a hit. The ship drove through the spray and debris from the explosion, shuddering but intact. The second kamikaze was seconds behind the first. This pilot, recognizing his leader's error, had shallowed his dive. He was coming in at 20 degrees, a glide more than a dive, trying to ensure he wouldn't overshoot. Chief Riley in Mount 51 had shifted fire to this second aircraft. His crew was loading and firing with mechanical precision. VT-fused 5-inch shells were exploding in a wall of shrapnel between the destroyer and the diving aircraft. At 800 feet altitude, one of those shells detonated 30 feet from the kamikaze's left wing. Shrapnel from the explosion shredded the wing's fabric covering, holed the fuel tank, and severed the aileron control cables. The Judy rolled violently left, completely out of control. The pilot, whose name would never be recorded, fought the controls desperately. The aircraft was dying around him, bleeding fuel and control authority, but he was still closing on the target. If he could hold it together for just a few more seconds. The Judy rolled completely inverted at 400 feet altitude, 200 feet from Leutze's bow. Still the pilot fought, trying to roll upright, trying to point his disintegrating aircraft at the target. At 100 feet altitude, the Judy's fuel tanks exploded. The aircraft became a fireball that plunged into the ocean 120 feet to port of Leutze's bow. Again, the destroyer shuddered from the underwater shock. Again, spray and debris cascaded across the foredeck. And again, Leutze drove through intact. On the bridge, Commander Leon gripped the rail and watched the remaining 4 kamikazes. 2 had broken off to attack other destroyers in the screen. 2 were still inbound toward Leutze, approaching from slightly starboard of the bow. Come right 5 degrees, steady on 355. Leon's course adjustment kept Leutze's bow pointed at the threats. The destroyer's forward batteries continued their fire, the 40mm Bofors guns now adding their volume to the 5-inch mount's precision. The sky ahead of the ship was filling with tracer rounds and proximity-fused explosions. The 3rd and 4th kamikazes, both A6M0s carrying 250-kilogram bombs, dove together in a coordinated attack. The pilots had been briefed to expect beam-on targets. They'd been trained to track lateral movement. But the American destroyer ahead of them was presenting the narrow profile they'd been told would only occur if they caught a ship by surprise during the initial approach. These pilots were more experienced than the first 2. One had 7 sorties, the other had 5. They understood that something was wrong with the tactical picture, that the Americans had changed their doctrine, but there was no time to abort and no fuel to try a different approach. They committed to their dives. The geometry betrayed them. Without lateral movement to track, they had to rely on estimation of dive angle and timing. The Zero's visibility over its nose during a steep dive was limited by the aircraft's long nose and inline engine. The pilots were making split-second judgments based on incomplete visual information. The 3rd Zero pulled out of its dive at 300 feet, the pilot convinced he was about to overshoot. The aircraft flattened into a shallow glide that brought it across Leutze's bow at mast height, missing the ship by 30 feet. The 40mm gunners tracked the aircraft as it flashed past, their quad mounts pouring rounds into the Zero's belly and tail. The aircraft made it 200 yards past the ship before its fuel tank exploded, sending the Zero spiraling into the ocean. The 4th Zero held its dive longer. This pilot had decided to dive through the anti-aircraft fire, rather than risk pulling out too early. It was a brave decision, and very nearly a successful one. The Zero was still diving, still under control, passing through 200 feet altitude with Leutze's bow filling the windscreen, when a proximity-fused 5-inch shell detonated 20 feet above the aircraft. The explosion didn't destroy the Zero. It killed the pilot. Shrapnel from the shell punched through the Zero's thin top armor and through the pilot's head and torso. The pilot was dead before his brain could register what had happened. The Zero, now pilotless but still intact and still diving at 400 miles per hour, plunged toward Leutze's bow. At the last instant, the aircraft's slightly unbalanced flight attitude caused it to roll fractionally right. The Zero impacted the ocean 15 feet to starboard of Leutze's bow, so close that men on the foredeck could feel the heat from the explosion. The impact detonated the bomb and the remaining fuel. Debris from the aircraft rained across Leutze's foredeck. A piece of the Zero's propeller, a curved blade 3 feet long, embedded itself in the forward superstructure 6 inches from where Lieutenant Commander Walsh was standing. Walsh stared at the bent metal protruding from the bulkhead beside him, close enough to touch, and realized his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. Commander Leon's voice came through the announcing system, still absolutely calm. All stations report damage and casualties. The reports came back within seconds. No hits, no casualties. Minor structural damage from underwater shock. All systems operational. Leutze had survived an attack by 6 kamikazes without taking a single direct hit. By following doctrine, by presenting her beam to the attack, sister ship Morris had been struck by 1 aircraft out of 6 and was combat ineffective. By violating doctrine, by charging directly at the kamikazes, Leutze had survived intact. The mathematics Lieutenant Henderson had calculated on a plotting table had been tested by blood, fire, and they had proven correct. But one successful engagement didn't constitute doctrine. It could have been luck. The kamikazes might have been poorly trained. The combat conditions might have been uniquely favorable. Before Leon's tactic could become accepted practice, it would need to be repeated, analyzed, and validated by other commanders. That process would take weeks of bitter combat. The story of how Leon's tactics spread through the destroyer fleet off Okinawa reveals much about how military innovation actually happens during wartime. It wasn't through official channels or tactical bulletins. It was through word of mouth, wardroom conversations, and the desperate willingness of commanders to try anything that might keep their ships afloat. April 7, 1945. Commander Leon filed his after-action report describing the engagement and his decision to maintain course toward the attacking aircraft. The report went through USS Leutze's division commander, then to the task group commander, and eventually landed on the desk of Rear Admiral Morton Deo, commander of the Bombardment and Fire Support Group for the Okinawa operation. Deo was a gunnery specialist who'd commanded destroyers earlier in his career. He understood both the mathematics of fire control and the psychological pressure of command under kamikaze attack. He read Leon's report 3 times, then called for his operations officer. "Get me comparative statistics on destroyer damage for ships that maintained course toward kamikaze attacks versus ships that turned beam on. I want numbers from every engagement since April 1st. The analysis took 2 days. The results were striking. Of 17 destroyers that had turned beam on when attacked by kamikazes, 9 had been hit. That was a 53% hit rate. Of 4 destroyers that had, for various reasons, maintained bow-on or stern-on attitudes during attacks, only 1 had been hit, a 25% hit rate. The sample size was small, statistically questionable, but the difference was large enough to be meaningful. Deo made a decision that bypassed the normal doctrine development process entirely. On April 9th, he sent a message to all destroyer commanders in the fire support group. The message was classified as tactical intelligence rather than operational orders, a distinction that would prove legally important later. The message read in part, "Analysis of recent kamikaze engagements suggests that maintaining course toward attacking aircraft may reduce hit probability compared to standard beam-on evasive doctrine. Commanding officers are encouraged to consider bow-on or stern-on attitudes during attacks when tactical situation permits. This represents analysis of limited data and does not constitute change to published doctrine." It was bureaucratic poetry, similar to Admiral Lockwood's guidance about emergency deep procedures for submarines. Deo wasn't ordering anyone to change tactics. He was sharing information and trusting his commanders to make their own decisions. For destroyer captains facing daily kamikaze attacks, that was enough. Between April 10th and April 16th, 1945, 12 more destroyer commanders tried variations of Leon's head-on approach. 8 reported successful outcomes with no hits. 3 were hit despite the tactic, though 2 of those hits occurred when the ships were forced to maneuver to avoid collisions with friendly vessels, breaking their bow-on attitude at critical moments. One commander, in a brutally honest after-action report, admitted he'd lost his nerve at the last moment and turned beam on, resulting in a hit that killed 23 of his crew. By April 20th, the tactic had acquired a nickname among destroyer sailors, "meeting them at the door." The phrase captured both the aggressive nature of the maneuver and the psychological shift it represented. Instead of evading, ships were attacking, driving, toward the threat rather than trying to minimize it. The mechanics of why the tactic worked became clearer through systematic analysis conducted by the Navy's Operations Research Group, a team of civilian mathematicians and engineers who'd been analyzing combat data throughout the war. Their report, classified secret and not declassified until 1973, provided mathematical confirmation of what Leon and Henderson had intuited. The critical factor was the target aspect problem. When a destroyer presented its beam to a diving kamikaze, the pilot had a clear visual reference for tracking. The ship's movement across his windscreen provided instant feedback about whether his dive path would result in a hit or a miss. If the ship was moving left to right and appeared to be moving forward in his windscreen, he was going to miss ahead and needed to steepen his dive or adjust his aim point. If the ship appeared to be dropping behind his nose, he was going to miss astern and needed to shallow his dive. This visual feedback loop allowed continuous correction throughout the 40 to 50 second dive. But when a destroyer presented its bow and drove toward the kamikaze, that feedback loop disappeared. The ship's aspect remained essentially constant. It grew larger as range decreased, but it didn't move laterally. The pilot had to estimate whether his dive angle would bring him to the target based solely on the rate at which the target appeared to grow in his windscreen. Human depth perception and distance estimation are far less accurate than lateral motion tracking. Pilots consistently overestimated or underestimated their dive angles when attacking bow-on targets. The Operations Research Group calculated that the error rate for bow-on attacks was approximately 3 times higher than for beam-on attacks. Moreover, the bow-on attitude reduced the target area by roughly 80%, just as Henderson had calculated. A destroyer's beam presented a target, approximately 370 feet long. The bow presented a target only 40 feet wide. For a kamikaze diving at 40 degrees and 400 miles per hour, that difference was enormous. A pilot who misjudged his aim point by 50 feet would still hit a beam-on destroyer. That same 50-foot error would result in a complete miss against a bow-on destroyer. There was another factor that the Operations Research Group identified through interviews with captured kamikaze pilots: the psychological impact of seeing a destroyer charge directly toward you while firing every gun that could bear created hesitation and doubt. Several captured pilots described feeling that the American ship was attacking them rather than defending itself. This psychological reversal, even if only momentary, disrupted the pilots' focus during the critical final seconds of their dives. One captured pilot, Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Tanaka, who'd survived being shot down during a kamikaze attack on April 18th, described his experience in interrogation. "I had attacked 2 ships before. Both times, the ships turned sideways. I could see where I would hit. I could adjust. But this ship, it came at me. All I could see was the bow getting larger. I could not tell if I was aimed correctly. I thought perhaps I should pull up and try again, but there was no fuel to try again. I dove, and I missed. Then the American fighters shot me down." The Japanese High Command never systematically recognized what was happening. Intelligence reports from returning escort pilots noted that some American destroyers were maintaining course toward attacks, but these reports were interpreted as individual tactical decisions by particularly aggressive commanders, rather than as a doctrinal shift. Japanese kamikaze training continued to emphasize attacks against beam-on targets because that's what most destroyers continued to present. The reason most destroyers continued using beam-on tactics reveals something important about military doctrine and institutional inertia. Despite Deo's message, and despite growing anecdotal evidence that bow-on tactics worked, many commanders remained reluctant to violate published doctrine. Their reluctance was understandable. If a commander followed standard procedure and his ship was hit, he'd followed orders and couldn't be blamed. If a commander violated procedure and his ship was hit, he risked court-martial for deviating from doctrine. By early May, approximately 40% of destroyers off Okinawa were using bow-on tactics at least some of the time. The other 60% continued following standard beam-on evasion. The statistical results were becoming undeniable. Destroyers using bow-on tactics had a hit rate of approximately 18%. Destroyers using beam-on tactics had a hit rate of approximately 47%. Using bow-on tactics more than halved the probability of being hit. On May 15, 1945, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance and the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet jointly issued a tactical bulletin that officially recognized bow-on tactics as an authorized alternative to standard evasive doctrine. The bulletin included detailed procedures: maintain maximum speed toward the threat, ensure fire control radars maintain lock, accept reduced number of guns in action in exchange for reduced target profile, and maintain course until impact or confirmed destruction of attacking aircraft. By June, bow-on tactics had become standard practice throughout the destroyer force. The kamikaze campaign continued through June and into July, but the hit rate against destroyers dropped dramatically. Between June 1st and the end of the war on August 15th, 42 destroyers were attacked by kamikazes. Only 7 were hit, a hit rate of 16.5% compared to over 50% in early April. The tactic had worked. It hadn't eliminated the kamikaze threat, nothing could do, that short of destroying the attacking aircraft, but it had cut the effectiveness of kamikaze attacks by more than 2/3. Hundreds of sailors owed their lives to Commander Leon's decision on April 6th and to Lieutenant Henderson's kitchen table mathematics. The legacy of the bow-on tactic extended beyond World War II. During the Korean War, when North Korean and Chinese aircraft occasionally attempted kamikaze-style attacks against United Nations ships, destroyers and cruisers automatically employed bow-on tactics. The tactic had become so ingrained in destroyer doctrine that it was simply how ships defended against diving aircraft attacks. Modern naval warfare has evolved beyond the scenarios that made bow-on tactics necessary. Anti-aircraft missiles engage threats at ranges measured in miles rather than yards. Close-in weapon systems like phalanx provide automated last-ditch defense. The kind of visual-range diving attacks that kamikazes employed are effectively obsolete, but the principle behind Leon's decision remains relevant. The principle is simple. Conventional wisdom isn't always correct, especially when the nature of the threat changes. The beam-on evasion doctrine had been developed for conventional bombing attacks where aircraft tried to survive. It made perfect sense in that context. But kamikazes weren't conventional attacks. They were guided missiles with human pilots, and defending against them required different tactics. The destroyer captains who recognized this, who were willing to question doctrine and try counterintuitive approaches, saved ships and lives. They demonstrated that tactical innovation doesn't always flow from headquarters to the fleet. Sometimes it flows the other way, from desperate commanders trying to keep their people alive through informal networks of shared experience to eventual official recognition. Commander Bruce Leon continued commanding USS Leutze through the end of the Okinawa campaign. His ship survived multiple subsequent kamikaze attacks, though Leon would later admit in his oral history that every time he ordered the ship toward an incoming kamikaze, his hands shook and his stomach twisted with fear. "It never became easy," he said. "Every time, you wondered if this would be the time the tactic failed, but the mathematics were sound, and I trusted the mathematics more than I trusted my fear." Lieutenant Junior Grade Paul Henderson, whose calculations had provided the foundation for the tactic, survived the war and eventually became a professor of naval architecture at MIT. He spent the rest of his career teaching engineering students about the importance of questioning assumptions and using mathematical analysis to solve tactical problems. The story of destroyer captains turning into kamikazes demonstrates that survival in combat often depends on the willingness to question conventional wisdom when circumstances change. The doctrine that said turn beam on to evading attacks was correct for one type of threat. It was catastrophically wrong for a different type of threat. The commanders who recognized this, who trusted mathematics over instinct and analysis over tradition, saved hundreds of lives. In April 1945, off Okinawa, American destroyer captains learned that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Sometimes reducing your firepower increases your survival. Sometimes charging directly at something trying to kill you is the smartest thing you can do. The mathematics supported it. The statistics proved it. And the men who trusted those numbers over their instincts went home alive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.